presenter, and that's Emeritus Professor Simon Easteal. And Simon was the founding director of the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics. That's headquartered at ANU, but Simon's recently retired, but still has a role with the National Centre as an emeritus professor. And I won't go into too much detail because I'm sure Simon will cover it off, but the National Centre was established in 2013. They've got an exceptional collection of biological samples that have been obtained from approximately 7,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And it's how do we look after that? And I know Alex was on the board there, governing board there, some time ago. I'm not sure if Greg's on there. But, this is one of the realities. We've got the same small number of people that are on everything because we are just really emerging in this space. Look, there's plenty that we could say about Simon and his work in this area, both nationally and internationally, and really exploring some of those key issues around genomics and the influence that it has in the whole life course, I guess, which is also important. Simon's on numerous editorial boards and advisory committees, task forces, and working parties. But he's also taken it that one step further, and that he set up, a personalised medicine company, and also on the advisory board of a couple of biotech companies. And so that's a bit about IP that I was referring to, Simon. I don't know if you wanted to reference any of that, but over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me all right? I'll just...
Yep.
I'd just like to start by adding to Tom's acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal people by recognising their continuing connection to the land that I'm on at the moment in Canberra. In this talk, I'll give you a brief introduction to the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics. I'm standing in giving this talk for Azure Hermes, who has just taken on the role of Deputy Director of the Centre, but couldn't be here today. And so I'll give an introduction to what we do, but my talk will be rather different than the one she might have given, and be more conceptual in nature, and perhaps address some of the details of the way in which we work with communities in questions at the end. And so I'm going to address the three questions that were put to us in this forum that are listed there. But first, very briefly, we work with Indigenous communities. As Tom mentioned, the basis on which we were established was to address the need to address the issue about the collection of material that already existed, and that's the sort of foundation that we've grown from. We work with Indigenous communities under Indigenous governance to create an enduring source of genomic information to improve the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And we have two major genomics projects underway. The first the first one that was funded was creating a population reference panel with funding from Bioplatforms Australia. And the second is creating an Aboriginal genome assemblies, which we hope will feed into the Pan-Human Reference Genome resource that's being developed currently. I refer back to, I would just say that the wonderful two presentations preceding it saved me an awful lot of trouble. A wonderful exposition of what's happening nationally and internationally from TIFF, and I have to endorse everything that Alex said in his presentation, which gave excellent context. And one of the things Alex mentioned was the working at the pace of trust, and I would I guess acknowledge the patience of the people that have been providing funding to us, because we have, in doing this, we're trying to do this in a way that through, if you like, an action research approach, try to develop these resources in the right way, rather than trying to develop them quickly and have them used rapidly and not take the care to do things the way they should be done. We work under it in governance. I'll go over this slightly and come back to circle round to it in the context of what Tom was mentioning about IP, because I think that what we have here is a governance arrangement which is extremely strong, and it takes advantage of the ANU's position as a Commonwealth body, which allows the council to make statutes that have the force of federal law. So we have an Indigenous majority board that reports to the council and therefore indirectly to the Parliament, that is established under a statute. So it's a statutory body. It's the only statutory body in the ANU. And its primary function is to be the custodian of the collection. So the board, it doesn't speak for the people that we work with, but it ensures that we do things. It provides Indigenous oversight of activities, ensuring that we do things the right way. Azure would have focused on our engagement with communities, which is really a very substantial part of what we do. We're working with communities around the country, and this has been a very long and detailed process that as I said, I hope maybe we can pick up on in question time. We put a huge amount of effort into this aspect of what we do. We have established 4 long read assemblies. These are genomes from representative people from these communities. And there's some technical information there, which I won't go through, but as I said, that's a resource that we're now trying to work out how that data gets used properly and integrated into national and international data resources that underpin genomics and precision medicine. I'll circle back to that too. In addition, from each of those communities, we have consented individuals to a sequence using the routine method of sequencing genomes. The previous data were the sort of foundational reference genomes that underpin all of this. In addition, we're creating representative information about variation that exists within each of these communities. I don't have time to go into this. I don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about all the people that are involved in this and so on, but perhaps, again, we can pick up on that. I also wanted to show a video that we use in the community consultation, but that it would be, I took it out initially because of the time constraints, and again, perhaps we can look at that if there's time at the end. But to go to the 3 questions that we're addressing, first of all, what is precision medicine? And I think perhaps the best way to answer that is to say that it's not in precision medicine, which is what we currently practice. And this is just a schematic here that reflects the fact that we deal with averages based largely on clinical trials in a medical context. Things only work for some people, and they fail to account for individual differences. In precision medicine, it doesn't work for everyone because it's based on averages, basically. What does the alternative look like? And I think a good example of that is the 100 Wellness Project that was published a few years ago, to make the point that this is not simply clinical genetics written large. This is about complexity. It's about a great diversity of different kinds of information that go well beyond omics about individual people over time. And what that means is that it depends on persistent, dense, dynamic data clouds. It's about data linked to people, and it's participatory. People have to be involved. And this presents challenges that are new because it doesn't follow a standard research model where you do a project and then wonder what to do with the data, perhaps, that has an endpoint then you move on. There is issues around long-term persistent governance of very detailed, complex, ever-changing data sets that are linked in a very detailed way to individual people. So it presents issues around new issues around governance, new issues around engagement with people, and new issues around the sovereignty of that data. So will it benefit Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples? I think the answer to that, I think as Alex has very ably, persuasively argued, yes, but if it's developed and implemented in the right way. And what I mean by that is that with recognition of how the data information is interpreted, incorporated, and translated meaningfully into the lives, experiences, and healthcare of individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds, with community wishes guiding how the data and the information is included and used, and with an understanding of what precision medicine is, what it's good for, and why people and communities should participate. As already mentioned by both Tiff and Alex, we have a very Eurocentric view of the world. This illustrates that point in relation to a particular kind of data, but it shows that over time, if we look at some of the smaller other and multiple populations, they've grown slightly, as have East Asians and people from other parts of the world. But that growth is largely linear, and whereas the European data, which has always been far greater, has grown exponentially. So although there is increased inclusion, there's in fact a growing disparity. Why does this matter? The reference data are the essential foundation for inclusion. And I don't wish to contribute to what I agree with Alex about, which is a coercive approach, but without this, there isn't inclusion. They improve population-specific discovery, functional investigation, and clinical interpretation. It's the foundation of all of this in all the areas in which this kind of information is important medically. And that includes diagnosis, prediction, discovery, therapy, and improved healthcare. So to make that point in relation to specifically to rare recessive monogenic diseases that largely affect children, what we know is that there are nearly 2,000 genes known to be linked to recessive disorders, but it's predicted that there will be close to 10,000 such genes discovered, so that we currently know about 20% of the connections between genes and these kind of diseases. But these genes don't cause disease. It's variation in the DNA in these genes that cause disease. And when we look at that, when we look at what about the variants, we see that each one of these diseases, it can be caused by as many as thousands of different DNA variants in one of these genes, or sometimes in more than one. And that these variants are almost all rare. There are some exceptions, but the rule is that they're rare. They're usually found only in one part of the world, or in people from one part of the world, or even in one small community, and sometimes even in a single family. So there is a need for inclusion as a baseline, if you like, of data on which to build precision medicine. So what are the next steps? And here I want to get a little bit conceptual, if you like. The essential requirements here are, in addition to that data, Indigenous leadership, good governance, transparency, and accountability. We've developed a model. As I said, I don't think that that's the best model, but it's a strong model. Lasting engagement between researchers, clinicians, and community based on trust and respect. And third, the national and international genomics data capability. So to illustrate why those are important in a sort of from a scientific perspective, I think it's useful to point out that genomics is not like pathology. So in pathology, you have a clinician orders a test and then gets the result of that test and puts that in the context of a clinical examination, makes a decision and informs the patient or informs the treatment of that patient. genomics is fundamentally different from that, in that behind that sits an enormous structure of data resources and information resources. To get from a sample taken from a patient and turn that through into a DNA sequence, and then from that to genomic data, and from that to biologically meaningful and then clinically meaningful data, requires a whole set of data and information resources. The sample has to be maintained in a repository, obviously, but foundational to this is the reference genome, or the now growing pan-human reference resource. But in addition to that, there are structured, formal ways of including in the information or relating the information to the data from a person, what the variation means biologically, and that's based on population reference data that are need to be meaningful, to be local, and then clinical processes for introducing clinical information from resources, information resources, and they again depend on clinical reference data. So all of this has to be built on massive national data and computational resources, as I said, it's persistent, it's ongoing, and people have to be directly connected so that there's a foundational requirement here for community engagement. So and there's feedback from the clinical information back into the data and information resources that underpin this. So that complexity presents new challenges. So I would, in relation to the data, what I mean, what I understand anyway by the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty is that, Alex has mentioned fair and care principles, that the data must reflect Indigenous interests and priorities rather than government and researchers' needs. Data management must be consistent with Indigenous laws, practices, and customs. Indigenous people must be involved in decisions affecting data collection, stewardship, access, and use. Capacity building must be integral to data collection and management, and Indigenous people must control the narrative around how the data relates to their lives. So if we look at building a platform for leadership in genomics and precision medicine, it's underpinned, which would then support clinical trials, diagnostic, predictive modeling, therapeutic development, targeted therapy, pharmacogenomics in a variety of different health, disease areas or health areas. That is built on community development and well-being and understanding of what this means in terms of the well-being of the community or communities, education and capability development, which we've already talked about, but governance and sovereignty and technology and data. I think these are things that I just would like to mention in particular, because I think the issues about sovereignty and governance are interrelated in the sense that there are models that I think accommodate this based on Marxian rather than liberal economics, if you like. Cooperative models, co-op models, where people have direct ownership through membership rights of what they contribute. And there are various ways in which people's different contributions can be rewarded. This allows, to go to the IP issue, this allows a control over the use of that information for, or the use of data both individually and collectively for therapeutic development and other commercial activities in a way that preserves the connection to people and the control over what happens. So I think that's something that should be given serious consideration and piloted in as a next step, if you like, for policy development and implementation. And finally, the technology and data. I think that it's very important to understand that that issue is not just about the sovereignty of data collected from a participant in a research project or from a patient, but it's about that entire, if you like, that ecosystem of data and information that I described. Mapping those issues onto that structure here. How does that work in relation to the pan-human reference genome resource? How does that work in relation to population reference data, clinical reference data, and so on? So understanding, looking at there are of course national sovereignty risk issues around some of this because they reside in other countries, in the United States particularly. So how do you preserve the integrity of this entire system in ways that are appropriate at different levels? So I think that's the other next step issue. I think that it would be really very helpful to address, looking at data in that broader context. So finally, just to make a point that there's already been made, but the right way for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is probably the right way for the rest of us. And that we might all benefit from a broad adoption of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can show us about how to do these things the right way. So I'll leave it with that, and if we have time, show the movie and perhaps address any of the issues that I've rather skipped over.
And thank you, Simon, for that. And pleasure to have you on. We would have loved to have had Azure on as well, but she couldn't make it for personal reasons. So thank you for stepping in on that. But Azure has been working with Aboriginal communities, particularly around Arnhem Land area I guess walking through with the community about how to utilise some of the samples of the 7,000 samples that they've got, and so it becomes an issue of ownership and some of the challenges of how do you access that data or the samples, what do you use with them. And I know there are other institutions around that have got similar great collections of samples, and who owns them. So that becomes a real challenge, I guess, in this process.
Tom, there's been one question come up, if we have time, or would you like to move on?
Thanks, Tiff. Yeah, if you could please, while I...
Okay, sure. So this is from Matilda. She's asking, has there been much engagement with, for example, funding bodies in how to recognise the requirements of this type of work, as opposed to more traditional approaches, as Simon outlined? So, Simon, you referred to the funding body's patience in your presentation, so perhaps expand on that a little bit.
Well, there has been engagement. I mean, we take the opportunities where they arise to discuss this, but the funding, it's not just funding agencies, but deputy vice chancellors, deans, directors, everybody else wants papers to come out, and they want quite rightly that want papers to come out, students to be graduated and so forth, and grants to be written. And it's very difficult. It's a constant tension, and I think it's something that could do with a lot more discussion, because there has to be, if you're going to do this properly, you have to take the time it takes. You can't rush and scramble to meet deadlines in order to meet those requirements. So it's a tension that is ongoing, and I think other people, I'm sure, are fully aware of, but it could use, I'm not sure what the solution is, but it does need to be addressed. I think perhaps again, if we could take some advice from, I'm speaking as a non-Indigenous person, we take advice from Indigenous people about how to do our work, and to go about things in a rather different way would benefit us all as well.
I've got a question for Simon. Can I ask it in the break?
5 minutes, so yes.
I want to ask about how do we educate the scientists on the fact that these things don't happen overnight, and we need to, because we have to tick boxes as scientists, but it's hard to tick boxes when you work in this space. We're always under pressure between keeping the academics happy that we are doing our job according to their standard, but taking priority that we are actually, our priority is to keep the standard of the communities that we work with. Do you have any answers to that?
I think the answer is the best we can, but you raise a very important point, and I think that the general point there is that capacity building goes both ways. We need to build capacity within the research community of people who are capable of working in appropriate ways with Indigenous people, and that does present a problem, particularly for younger people building a career that are under the pressures of getting their next postdoc and so forth, and getting the indicators of the normal standard indicators of productivity and achievement that are required. So it's we attempt. I say that in the present tense, although this year obviously we haven't done any visits to communities, but we attempt to take collaborators, students, postdocs, people to community on visits. Azure takes people with her to give them a sense of what community life is like and what this kind of work means to people in communities, so they get an understanding of that. We bring people from communities to Canberra, again, I say in the present tense, to meet and talk to people here. That's there are straightforward things you can do, but it is a I think it's terribly important that people do this, and I think, as I said, that we'd all be better off for it.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally agree. It's just, as the question was before, it's hard to fund and it's hard to then meet KPIs to be able to do that. So absolutely. It's just nice to know that we're not alone in the world in trying to fight this battle.
Yes.
Thanks, Simon.
Imagine your veins are like rivers and your blood is like their waters, with lots of stories to tell. They actually let us know where we come from and explain to us why we get sick. These stories are already in the blood in our bodies and are written in language that doctors and scientists can understand. These stories are called DNA, and the stories come from both our mothers and fathers. They got the DNA stories from their mothers and fathers, who got it from their mothers and fathers. Because this has been going on for thousands of years, DNA stories can tell the story of a very, very big family. People share some of their stories with other people from the same area, even if they are not from the same family or clan. So when we look into the story of the DNA for a person, we also see a little part of the DNA story of their ancestors from thousands of years ago. Understanding the DNA stories can help scientists to understand more about why some families and communities have lots of people with diseases like diabetes and kidney problems, and other families have only a few. It can also help us understand why medicines work well for some people, but for other people they don't work or can even make them sick. Long time ago, small bits of blood called samples were taken from Aboriginal people in communities all over Australia. Right now, the samples are being kept at the Australian National University in Canberra. A mob called the National Centre for Indigenous Genomics, NCIG, are looking after them. This mob have a board with mostly Aboriginal people. They know it's important for us to know about our blood and our stories. They are not really sure how much those old people knew about giving their blood samples. So they think that their families should be able to decide now what to do with them. If you and your family decide that the samples should stay in the collection, the NCIG mob would get the DNA story out of the sample and read the story of the blood onto computers. The DNA stories from each sample will be put together with the stories from all around Australia to make a library. The stories in this library computer will have no names, only the DNA story and the community where the sample came from. Sometimes researchers, like doctors, who are looking to find out more about diseases might ask to look at some of the DNA stories. They will have to ask the NCIG mob first. If the NCIG mob think that their project could help Aboriginal people, they will let them read the story, only for that project. The NCIG mob are being very careful to make sure that Aboriginal people are in charge of decisions about who can read the stories and what they can read them for. You'll be able to see what the sample is being used for on an app on your mobile phone or computer, so you can say no anytime you want to using that app. This is a very new thing for everyone, but the NCIG mob want to make sure that the DNA stories can be used to help Aboriginal families and all Aboriginal people. Keeping these stories might be very important for all Aboriginal people. What do you mob think about that?